Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for your help. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video makes a bigger difference than you could possibly imagine. It genuinely helps the channel grow and reach more people who love this kind of content. If you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review there also helps out tremendously. And if you're up for it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone's tuning in from, but only if you want to share. And of course, if you're enjoying what we do here, subscribing to the channel means the world to us. Alright, let's get into tonight's story. The Calibration Window. A quiet UFO encounter. No one was supposed to witness. There are moments in science when everything goes quiet in the wrong way, not the peaceful quiet of a solved problem or a confirmed hypothesis. The other kind. The kind that makes you check your equipment 3 times, reboot systems that have run flawlessly for months, and question whether the flaw is in the machinery or in your understanding of what machinery is supposed to measure. This is a story about one of those moments. It takes place at a research station so remote that most people have never heard of it. The work performed there is important but profoundly boring. Monitoring atmospheric conditions, calibrating instruments, and maintaining systems that feed data into larger networks. Most scientists never think about. It is the kind of job where nothing ever happens, which is exactly the point. Consistency is the goal. Anomalies are errors. Deviations are corrected. Until the night when every instrument disagreed with reality in precisely the same way. The person who experienced this event is a career environmental technician, someone trained to trust data over intuition, to follow protocols over hunches, and to assume equipment failure before considering impossible alternatives. This makes what happened next particularly significant. Because when someone conditioned to dismiss the extraordinary starts questioning whether the sky itself can be wrong, something fundamental has shifted. The official record of that night shows nothing unusual. Logs were filed, calibration was completed, systems returned to normal operations. But between the lines of those reports exists a different story. One about what happens when our tools for measuring reality briefly stop filtering out what they were never designed to detect. This is not a story about alien spacecraft descending from the clouds or mysterious lights racing across the horizon. There were no beams of light, no glowing orbs, no impossible maneuvers captured on video. What happened was quieter than that, more subtle, and in many ways more disturbing, because the thing that appeared that night did not arrive. It was already there, and the only reason anyone noticed was because, for a brief window of time, the instrument stopped telling reality what it was supposed to be. Chapter 1. The Assignment. The Kaibab Atmospheric Research Station sits on the edge of the Arizona Strip, a region so isolated that cellular signals are a memory, and the nearest town is measured in hours, not miles. The facility itself is modest, a cluster of prefabricated buildings, a communications tower, and a field of sensitive instruments designed to monitor atmospheric composition, electromagnetic fluctuations, and pressure variations across multiple altitudes. Maya Torres had worked at Kaibab for 6 years. She was not a scientist in the traditional sense. Her official title was Environmental Monitoring Technician, which meant she maintained the equipment, performed routine calibrations, and ensured that the data being collected remained accurate and consistent. It was solitary work, but she preferred it that way. No office politics, no mandatory meetings. Just her, the equipment, and the vast empty sky. Most of the time, the station ran itself. Automated systems collected data continuously, feeding information into national weather models and atmospheric research databases. Maya's job was to intervene when something went wrong or when scheduled maintenance required human oversight. She had performed calibration procedures hundreds of times. The process was straightforward: power down sensors, run diagnostic tests, adjust settings based on known atmospheric baselines, and bring everything back online. Boring, predictable, exactly what scientific monitoring should be. The assignment that night was routine. A scheduled low-activity window had been designated for recalibration of the primary sensor array. Weather conditions were optimal. Clear skies, minimal wind, no storms within 1,000 miles. The timing was deliberate. Calibration worked best when the atmosphere was stable, with no external variables that might skew readings or interfere with baseline measurements. Maya arrived at the station just before sunset. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in shades of orange and red as the sun dropped toward the horizon. She had always loved this time of day. The light softened everything, made the emptiness feel less lonely. Inside the operations building, she logged into the primary system and reviewed the calibration schedule. Everything was green across the board. Air pressure, normal. Temperature gradients, within expected ranges. Electromagnetic readings, baseline static. The instruments showed exactly what they were supposed to show, which meant she could begin the shutdown sequence without complications. She initiated the protocol at 2100 hours. The sensors would go offline in stages, allowing her to test and recalibrate each subsystem individually. The entire process was expected to take 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours if she encountered any drift in the older equipment. She had brought coffee and a tablet loaded with a novel she had been meaning to finish. She expected boredom, not mystery. The first phase went smoothly. Pressure sensors came offline without issue. Temperature monitors powered down cleanly. The electromagnetic array, always the most finicky part of the system, shut down after a brief initialization delay, but nothing unusual. Maya worked methodically, running diagnostics on each component, making minor adjustments, and logging everything in the maintenance database. It was during the second phase, when she began bringing systems back online, that the first inconsistency appeared. The air pressure readings spiked, not dramatically, not enough to trigger an alert, but enough to make her pause. The numbers suggested a localized pressure drop, as if a low-altitude weather front had suddenly materialized directly overhead. Maya frowned. The weather satellite feed showed nothing. The sky outside remained clear. She checked the sensor housing for obstructions or damage. Nothing. She reset the sensor. The reading stabilized briefly, then spiked again. Same magnitude, same pattern. Maya pulled up the historical data. Pressure anomalies at Kaibab were rare, but not unheard of. Occasionally, thermal gradients from the desert floor created brief instabilities, but those events were diffuse, spread across multiple sensors. This was different. The anomaly was concentrated in a single region of the sky, directly above the station, and it was not moving. She switched to the electromagnetic monitors. They had just come back online, and the readings made her stomach tighten. Localized distortion. High-frequency interference across multiple bands. The pattern was consistent with ionospheric disruption, the kind caused by solar flares or high-altitude electrical storms. But there were no storms, no solar activity, and the distortion was not atmospheric, it was spatial. Something was interfering with the instruments, something large, and according to the data, it was stationary, hovering right above her. Chapter 2. The first inconsistency. Maya stood in the operations room, staring at the monitors. Her training told her this was equipment failure, probably a grounding issue or a calibration error she had introduced during the reset sequence. Instruments disagreed with each other all the time. That was why calibration existed. But instruments did not usually disagree in the same direction. She pulled up a multi-sensor overlay, combining data from pressure, electromagnetic, and thermal monitoring systems. Each system operated independently, using different technologies and different baselines. They should not correlate unless they were measuring the same phenomenon. The overlay showed a clear pattern. A region of space approximately 200 meters above the station was registering anomalies across all systems simultaneously. Pressure readings suggested localized or displacement, as if the air itself was being compressed or moved aside. Electromagnetic sensors detected interference patterns consistent with a dense conductive mass. Thermal imaging showed a cold spot, not frigid, but noticeably cooler than the surrounding atmosphere, and yet, visually, the sky was empty. Maya checked the radar feed. Nothing. The station's weather radar was not sophisticated, but it could detect aircraft, large birds, and significant atmospheric disturbances. The screen showed a flat green field, no contacts, no movement. She ran a systems diagnostic. All sensors returned green. No hardware faults, no communication errors. The instruments were functioning correctly. They were simply reporting something that should not exist. Maya felt the first creeping edge of unease. She had been trained to trust data over perception. If the instruments said something was there, something was there. But she also knew that reality did not bend to accommodate sensor readings. If the radar showed nothing and the sky looked normal, then the instruments were wrong. Except they were not wrong. They were precise, consistent, and impossibly unanimous. She saved the data stream to a local file and tagged it for review. Then, against every instinct that told her to stay inside and reboot the system, she grabbed a flashlight and walked outside. The night had settled fully. The sky was a deep, flawless black, scattered with stars that seemed sharper and closer than usual. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a pale ribbon, undisturbed. The air was cool and still. No wind, no sound except the faint hum of the equipment inside the station. Maya tilted her head back and looked directly overhead, toward the region where the instruments insisted something existed. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just stars, just darkness. Then she noticed the dimming. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A section of the sky, roughly the size of her open hand, held at arm's length, where the stars seemed fainter, not obscured, not hidden, just less, as if the light from those stars was travelling through something that absorbed a fraction of it. Not enough to block them entirely, just enough to dull them. Maya moved her head slightly to the left. The dimmed area did not move with her. She stepped forward. The area remained stationary in the sky. She stepped back. It stayed in place. Whatever this was, it was not an optical illusion. It was spatial. She raised her flashlight and aimed it directly at the dimmed region. The beam stretched upward, illuminating nothing but empty air. But as the light passed through the space where the stars looked fainter, it seemed to scatter. Not reflect, not refract. It dispersed, as if the air itself had become thicker, denser, more resistant to light. Maya lowered the flashlight. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. She had seen atmospheric phenomena before. Ice crystals, temperature inversions, light, pollution creating false halos. But this was none of those things. This was something occupying space without being visible. Something dense enough to register on pressure sensors, conductive enough to distort electromagnetic fields, and cold enough to show up on thermal imaging, and it was hovering, motionless, directly above the station. She stood there for a long moment, staring up at the faint wrongness in the sky. Then she turned and walked back inside. Chapter 3. Visual confirmation without shape. Maya locked the door behind her, even though there was nothing to lock it against. The gesture was instinctive, a way of asserting control over a situation that felt increasingly uncontrollable. Inside, the monitors still showed the same anomaly, unchanged, unmoving. She pulled up the optical telescope feed, a system used for observing cloud formations and high-altitude atmospheric events. The telescope was programmed to track specific coordinates. She entered the location of the anomaly and waited for the image to load. The feed showed nothing, just stars, just darkness. But when she adjusted the exposure settings, something changed. The stars in the center of the frame dimmed. Not by much, maybe 15–20%. Enough to notice if you were looking for it. And around those dimmed stars, the darkness itself seemed textured. Not black, not empty, but thick, as if space itself had gained weight. Maya zoomed in. The texture became more apparent. It was not static. It was shifting very slowly, like heat distortion or the shimmer of air above hot pavement. But the air outside was cool. There was no thermal source, and the distortion was not confined to the visible spectrum. Infrared imaging showed the same effect. Ultraviolet showed it more clearly. Whatever this was, it existed across multiple wavelengths. She pulled up the spectral analysis software, a tool used to identify chemical compositions in atmospheric samples. She aimed the spectrometer toward the anomaly and ran a scan. The results made no sense. The software detected trace elements consistent with normal atmospheric composition: nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide. But the density measurements were wrong. The air in the region above the station was registering as significantly denser than it should be. Not compressed, not pressurized, just denser, as if something was occupying the same space as the air without displacing it. Maya saved the data and cross-referenced it with historical records. She found 3 similar events, all logged as equipment malfunctions, all dismissed after brief review, all occurring during calibration windows. A pattern. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She was not a physicist. She did not have the training to explain what she was seeing, but she understood measurement. And she understood when measurements stopped making sense. The instruments were not malfunctioning. They were detecting something real, something that existed in physical space but did not behave like matter, something that absorbed light without reflecting it, displaced air without moving it, and registered on sensors without appearing on radar. She stood and walked back outside. This time she brought the portable spectrometer. She wanted confirmation. She wanted to be sure. The dimmed section of sky was still there, still stationary. She aimed the spectrometer directly at it and ran another scan. The readings matched the telescope data. Increased density, no chemical anomalies, just space that felt heavier than it should. Maya lowered the device and looked up. The stars were still dim. The air still felt thick. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this was not a calibration error. This was something else, something that had always been there, invisible, undetected, until, briefly, the instrument stopped filtering it out. Chapter 4. The Shadow. That isn't dark. Maya had been trained to approach problems methodically, identify variables, eliminate possibilities, narrow the field until only one explanation remained. But the more she measured, the less sense anything made. She returned to the operations room and pulled up every available data stream: seismic sensors, acoustic monitors, magnetic field detectors, infrared, radar, everything the station had. Most systems showed nothing unusual, but a few registered faint anomalies, always in the same location, always localized to the region directly overhead, and always inconsistent with known atmospheric or electromagnetic phenomena. The seismic sensors buried 30 meters below the surface detected a faint vibration. Not rhythmic, not mechanical, just a persistent low-frequency hum, barely above background noise. The acoustic monitors picked up the same thing, a sound that was not quite a sound, more like pressure, a sensation of density in the air. Maya put on headphones and isolated the acoustic signal. It was subtle, almost below the threshold of hearing, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to pulse very slowly. The frequency was low enough that it felt more than heard, a vibration in the chest, a weight in the skull. She removed the headphones and rubbed her temples. She had been awake for 12 hours. Fatigue was setting in. Maybe that explained the unease. Maybe she was reading patterns into noise. But the instruments did not get tired, and they all agreed. She checked the time. 2,300 hours. The calibration window was scheduled to close at midnight. After that, systems would return to full automated monitoring. Whatever this was, it would either disappear or remain. Either way, she would have data, evidence, something to present to her supervisors. She decided to go outside one more time. She wanted to see if the anomaly had changed, if it had moved, if it had done anything that might help her understand what she was looking at. The night air hit her as she stepped outside, cooler now, dry. The stars overhead were brilliant, except for that one section, that one patch of sky where they seemed muted. Maya walked away from the station, into the open desert. She wanted distance, perspective. She wanted to see if the anomaly was fixed to a location, or if it was something else, something relative. She walked 50 meters, stopped, looked up. The dimmed region of sky had shifted. Not much, but noticeably. It was no longer directly overhead. It was slightly to the east. She walked another 50 meters, looked up again. The anomaly had shifted again, always maintaining the same relative position, always staying between her and a specific point in space. Maya's chest tightened. This was not a localized atmospheric effect. This was not equipment error. This was something occupying a fixed position in three-dimensional space. And as she moved, her perspective of it changed. She pulled out her phone and opened the compass app. She marked her current position, then walked in a wide circle around the station, stopping every 30 meters to check the sky. The anomaly tracked, always visible, always in the same relative position. A fixed point in space that only revealed itself through the absence of light. Maya completed the circle and returned to her starting position. She checked her notes. The anomaly was located approximately 200 meters above the station, offset slightly to the northeast. It did not move, it did not rotate, it did not pulse or flicker. It simply existed, silent, invisible, and utterly indifferent to being observed. She stood there for a long time, staring up at it. The desert around her was silent. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of traffic or aircraft. Just the vast empty night and the faint wrongness in the sky that refused to resolve into anything she could name. And then, very suddenly, it was gone. Chapter 5. The calibration window closes. Maya did not see it disappear. One moment it was there, faint, subtle, but undeniably present, and the next moment it was not. The stars in that section of sky brightened instantly, as if a veil had been lifted. The air felt lighter. The pressure in her chest eased. She checked her watch. Midnight, exactly. The calibration window had closed. She ran back to the operations room and pulled up the sensor logs. The transition was visible in the data. At precisely 0 hours, all anomalies ceased. Pressure readings normalized. Electromagnetic interference vanished. Thermal signatures returned to baseline. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, but there was no switch, no mechanism, no physical process that could explain such an abrupt transition. Maya scrolled through the logs, looking for any indication of movement, anything that might suggest the object had departed, but the data showed no departure, no acceleration, no directional change. The anomaly did not leave, it simply stopped. Being detectable, she exported the data to an external drive and flagged the event in the maintenance log. Protocol required her to report any unusual sensor activity. She wrote a brief summary, careful to keep her language clinical and factual. Anomalous readings, localized disturbances, possible equipment drift. She did not mention the visual observations. She did not mention the dimmed stars or the spatial wrongness, or the sense that something vast and invisible had been hovering above the station, watching. She submitted the report and powered down the non-essential systems. The calibration was complete. Everything was back online. The station would resume normal operations. She sat in the operations room for another hour, staring at the monitors. Everything was green. Everything was normal. But she could not shake the feeling that something was still there, just beyond the range of the instruments, just outside the boundaries of what the sensors were designed to detect. At 0200 hours, she finally left the station and drove back to her quarters, a small prefab unit 10 miles down the access road. She did not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night in her mind. The data, the observations, the impossible consistency of something that should not exist. The next morning, she received an automated message from the central office. Her report had been reviewed. The anomalies were classified as sensor drift caused by the recalibration process. No further action required. The data had been archived and flagged as corrupted. Maya read the message twice. Then she opened the external drive where she had saved the raw data files. They were still there, untouched, unaltered, proof that what she had seen was real. But proof of what? Chapter 6. The data problem. For the next 3 days, Maya tried to put the event out of her mind. She returned to her routine, monitored systems, ran diagnostics, maintained equipment. Everything functioned normally. The station hummed along quietly, collecting data, feeding it into larger networks, contributing to models and forecasts that scientists thousands of miles away would analyze without ever thinking about where the data came from. But Maya could not stop thinking about that night. She pulled up the archived files during her off hours, examining the sensor logs over and over. The patterns were too consistent to be noise, too precise to be drift, and the visual observations, the dimmed stars, the spatial displacement, the way the anomaly tracked with perspective, those could not be explained by equipment error. She researched atmospheric phenomena, temperature inversions, light refraction, ice crystal formations. None of them matched. She looked into electromagnetic anomalies, solar wind interactions, ionospheric disturbances. Nothing fit. She expanded her search. UFO reports, military sightings, classified radar data. Most of it was noise. Speculation. Misidentified aircraft or weather balloons. But buried in the noise were a handful of cases that felt familiar. Reports of objects that did not reflect light. Radar contacts that appeared and disappeared without movement. Pressure anomalies detected by weather stations during clear conditions. All of them dismissed. all of them written off as equipment malfunction or observer error. Maya began to suspect that the problem was not with the data. The problem was with the system that reviewed the data, a system designed to filter out anomalies, to reject readings that did not conform to expected patterns, to classify the impossible as corrupted. She reached out to a colleague at another monitoring station, carefully, indirectly. She described the sensor readings without mentioning her own observations. She asked if he had ever seen anything similar. His response was immediate. Yes, once, 3 years ago. During a calibration window, localized pressure drop, electromagnetic interference, visual distortion. He had reported it. The data had been flagged as corrupted. He was told not to pursue it. Maya thanked him and ended the conversation. She contacted another colleague, a technician at a facility in Nevada. Same question, same careful phrasing, same answer. She spoke to 6 people over the next week. 5 of them had experienced similar events, always during calibration windows, always dismissed as equipment error. 1 of them had tried to escalate the issue. He was reassigned. A pattern was forming, not of sightings, but of silence, a quiet, systematic suppression of data that did not fit the expected model. Maya realized something unsettling. The system was not designed to detect anomalies. It was designed to filter them out, to smooth over inconsistencies, to ensure that the data fed into larger networks remained clean, predictable, and free of anything that might require explanation. Which meant that if something was out, there something invisible, something silent, something that only became detectable when instruments briefly dropped their assumptions, it could exist indefinitely without ever being acknowledged. Not because it was hidden, because it was filtered. Chapter 7. Unofficial Confirmation. Maya did not escalate her findings. She had seen what happened to people who pushed too hard. Reassignments, quiet dismissals. The message was clear. Do your job, maintain the equipment, and do not ask questions about data that does not fit the model. But she continued her research. Quietly, methodically. She built a database of similar events, cross-referencing sensor logs from stations across the country. She looked for patterns, locations, timing, conditions. What she found disturbed her. The events were not random. They clustered around specific types of facilities, research stations, weather monitoring sites, remote observatories, places with sensitive instruments, places that performed regular calibrations. And the events almost always occurred during low-activity windows, periods when systems were temporarily reset, when filters were briefly disabled, when instruments measured reality without telling it what it was allowed to be. Maya began to formulate a theory. It was speculative, it lacked physical mechanism, but it explained the data better than anything else she had considered. The anomalies were not arriving. They were already there, invisible, undetectable under normal conditions. But during calibration windows, when instruments operated without filters, without assumptions, without built-in corrections, they briefly registered something that existed outside the expected model. Something large, something dense, something that occupied space without interacting with light in conventional ways. She tested the theory by reviewing historical data from her own station. She went back years, searching for anomalies that occurred during calibration. Windows. She found dozens, all logged, all dismissed as drift or corruption, all sharing the same basic characteristics: localized pressure changes, electromagnetic interference, visual distortion. And all of them, she realized, had been occurring in the same region of sky, directly above the station, for years. Whatever this was, it was not transient, it was persistent, and it had been there long before Maya arrived, long before the station was built, possibly long before anyone thought to measure the sky with instruments sensitive enough to detect it. She saved her findings to an encrypted file and considered her options. She could report this, formally, with evidence, but she already knew what would happen. The data would be flagged. The files would be archived. She would be told, politely but firmly, to move on. Or she could stay quiet, continue monitoring, wait for another calibration window, gather more data, build a case too large to ignore. She chose the latter. Chapter 8. The theory forms. Maya spent the next 2 months preparing. She upgraded the station's data logging systems, increasing storage capacity and resolution. She synchronized her instruments with atomic clocks to ensure precise temporal correlation. She mapped the sky above the station in multiple wavelengths, creating a baseline that would allow her to detect even subtle deviations. And she waited. The next scheduled calibration window was set for late March. Clear weather, minimal solar activity, optimal conditions. She submitted the maintenance request and received approval without issue. As the date approached, Maya found herself both anxious and excited. She had spent years performing routine tasks, maintaining systems that functioned perfectly and produced nothing unexpected. The monotony had been comforting, safe, but now knowing what might be waiting just beyond the range of her instruments. The routine felt insufficient. She arrived at the station 3 hours, early on the night of the calibration. She checked every system twice. She verified data logging. She ran diagnostics on backup instruments. Everything was ready. At 2100 hours, she initiated the shutdown sequence. The sensors went offline in stages: pressure monitors, temperature arrays, electromagnetic detectors. One by one, the systems powered down, leaving brief windows of unfiltered observation as they reset. The first anomaly appeared 17 minutes into the process. Localized pressure drop, directly overhead. Same magnitude as before, same spatial characteristics. Maya's pulse quickened. She activated the optical telescope and aimed it at the coordinates. The stars dimmed. The air thickened. The instruments registered something vast and silent, occupying space 200 meters above the station. She stepped outside. The night was clear. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. And overhead, in a section of sky that should have been empty, the stars looked wrong. Maya raised her spectrometer and ran a full scan. Density readings spiked. Chemical composition remained normal, but the spatial characteristics were impossible. The air above the station was denser than it should be. Not compressed, not heated, just denser. As if something was sharing the same space as the atmosphere without displacing it. She adjusted the spectrometer settings, increasing sensitivity. The readings became more detailed. The density gradient was not uniform. It varied slightly, creating a faint texture in the data, almost like a surface, almost like the boundary of something solid. Maya's mind raced. She had spent months thinking about this moment, preparing theories, considering explanations. But now, standing beneath the dimmed stars, staring at data that should not exist, all her theories felt inadequate. This was not a vehicle. It was not a craft passing through. It was not a weather phenomenon or an atmospheric anomaly. This was something, occupying a fixed position in space. Something that had been there for years, possibly decades, invisible except during brief windows when instruments stopped filtering reality. And the most disturbing part was not that it existed. The most disturbing part was that it had gone unnoticed for so long, not because it was hidden, not because it was secret, but because the systems designed to observe the sky were also designed to reject observations that did not fit the model. Maya stood there for a long time, recording data, taking measurements, documenting everything. And then, at midnight, the calibration window closed. The anomaly vanished. The stars brightened. The instruments normalized. But this time, Maya had proof. High-resolution data, multiple sensors, visual confirmation. Everything logged and time-stamped. Evidence that could not be dismissed as corruption or drift. She returned to the operations room and compiled the data into a report. She made it thorough, clinical, factual. She included graphs, spectral analysis, and comparative data from historical events. She submitted it to her supervisor with a request for formal review. The response came 3 days later. Her report had been received. The data had been reviewed by the technical team. The anomalies were classified as calibration artifacts. No further action required. The files had been archived. Maya read the message and felt something inside her harden. They were not ignoring the data because it was insufficient. They were ignoring it because acknowledging it would require explanations they could not provide. Chapter 9. The After Effect. Maya continued working at the station. She performed her duties. She maintained the equipment. She filed reports. But something had changed. The work felt hollow now, performative. She was maintaining systems designed to measure reality, while simultaneously filtering out anything that challenged the model. She found herself staring at the sky, more often, especially at night, especially overhead. She knew the anomaly was there. She could not see it. She could not measure it without triggering a calibration window. But she could feel it. A presence, a weight, something vast and patient occupying space that everyone agreed was empty. The sensation was not fear, it was proximity, an awareness of being observed by something that existed in the margins of perception, something that had been there all along, invisible, until briefly, accidentally, the instruments noticed. Maya began to wonder how many other things existed in those margins, how many phenomena went undetected because the tools designed to observe them were also designed to reject observations that did not conform to expectations. How much of reality was filtered out before it ever reached human awareness? She thought about the scientific method, hypothesis, observation, testing. The process works beautifully when applied to predictable, repeatable phenomena. But what about the things that only appeared when systems temporarily dropped their assumptions? What about the things that existed outside the boundaries of what instruments were programmed to detect? Science measured what it expected to find, and when it found something unexpected, it classified it as error. Maya started keeping a personal log, not official reports, just observations, notes, thoughts. She documented the times when the sky felt wrong, when the stars seemed dimmer, when the air felt thicker. She recorded sensor readings during routine operations, looking for faint anomalies that might indicate the presence of something the systems were designed to ignore. She found patterns, subtle, easily dismissed, but consistent. The world, she realized, was layered. Visible reality existed alongside something else, something that occupied the same space but did not interact with it in conventional ways. And humanity, with all its instruments and models and expectations, remained oblivious, not because the evidence was absent, but because the systems designed to collect evidence were also designed to discard anything that did not fit. Epilogue. The part we never measure. Maya still works at the Kaibab Atmospheric Research Station. She still performs calibrations. She still maintains equipment. And every few months, During scheduled low-activity windows, she watches the instruments briefly register something that should not exist. She no longer reports it. There is no point. The system is not designed to acknowledge anomalies. It is designed to smooth them over, to classify them as error, to ensure that the data remains clean and predictable. But Maya knows the truth. The anomalies are not errors. They are glimpses, brief accidental observations of something that exists beyond the boundaries of what we are prepared to measure. She has stopped thinking about the anomaly as a single event. She now understands it as a symptom, evidence that reality is more complex than our tools allow us to perceive, that the instruments we use to observe the world also constrain what we are able to see. Science measures what it expects to find, but expectation is a filter, and filters, by design, remove signal along with noise. Maya wonders sometimes what would happen if the filters were removed entirely, if instruments were allowed to measure reality without assumptions, without corrections, without built-in models of what is and is not possible. She suspects the results would be overwhelming, incomprehensible, full of phenomena that defy explanation, but also, perhaps, full of truth. Because the thing that appeared above the station that night did not arrive. It was already there. And the only reason anyone noticed was because, briefly, the instrument stopped telling reality what it was allowed to be. Maya has come to accept that she will never fully understand what she observed. She does not have the tools, the training, the framework, but she no longer needs to understand. Because understanding is not the point. The point is awareness, the recognition that the world is larger, stranger, and more layered than we allow ourselves to perceive, that the boundaries of our knowledge are defined not by what exists, but by what we are willing to measure. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, when the desert stretches endlessly in all directions and the stars overhead burn cold and distant, Maya looks up at the section of sky where the anomaly once appeared. She knows it is still there, invisible, silent, indifferent, and she feels something that is not quite fear and not quite wonder, a recognition that the universe is full of things we do not see. Not because they are hidden, but because we have built systems that ensure we never look. The instruments hum quietly in the operations room. The data flows smoothly into networks and models. The world remains predictable, explainable, safe, but Maya knows better, and she suspects deep down that the universe is waiting, patient, persistent, for the moment when humanity finally decides to stop filtering reality and start measuring what is actually there. Until then, the anomalies will remain, logged as errors, dismissed as drift, quietly archived in databases no one will ever review. And overhead in the vast emptiness of the night sky, something vast and invisible will continue to occupy space that everyone agrees is empty. Because we never detected them because they arrived. We detected them because, briefly, we stopped telling reality what it was allowed to be. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a tremendous difference in helping others discover these stories. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone tunes in from across the globe. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. Now, let's begin. The quiet signal. A UFO encounter that was never meant to be seen. There are moments in life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary without warning. No fanfare, no dramatic build-up. Just a quiet shift in reality that leaves you questioning everything you thought you understood about the world around you. This is not the story of a believer searching the skies for confirmation. This is not the testimony of someone who spent their nights hoping for contact. This is the account of someone who experienced something impossible during the most mundane moment of their life, in a place where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. What you're about to hear is documented through personal testimony, corroborated sighting reports, and electromagnetic interference logs that were never meant to be connected. This is the story of an encounter that arrived without sound, departed without explanation, and left behind only questions that refused to fade. This is the quiet signal. Chapter 1. A routine that breaks. The high desert of Nevada holds a particular kind of silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a quality of stillness that feels almost deliberate. During the day, the landscape bakes under relentless sun. At night, temperatures plummet, and the darkness becomes so complete that the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light. Marcus Webb had lived on his property outside of Tonopah for 11 years. A former telecommunications technician, he had purchased the 40-acre plot specifically for its isolation. No neighbours within 5 miles, no city lights to pollute the night sky. Just sagebrush, Joshua trees, and the kind of quiet that most people find uncomfortable. Every night, Marcus followed the same routine. Around 10 in the evening, he would walk the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines and ensuring his small flock of chickens had been secured for the night. The walk took approximately 45 minutes. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain, every angle of the landscape by heart. On the night of October 17th, 2023, Marcus began his walk as usual. The temperature had dropped to the mid-40s. Clear sky. No moon. The kind of night where you could see satellites crossing overhead like slow-moving stars. He had walked this route hundreds of times. He knew exactly how the starlight would catch on the distant mountains. He knew which parts of the fence needed extra attention. He knew the sounds of the desert at night, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant cry of coyotes. Everything felt normal. The stars were visible in their usual configurations. Orion rising in the east, the Big Dipper hanging low in the north. Marcus wasn't an astronomy enthusiast, but he knew the sky well enough to notice if something was out of place. He was approximately 20 minutes into his walk when the first change occurred. It was subtle, so subtle that he almost didn't register it. The ambient sound of the desert, the faint whisper of wind through sage, the distant insect chirps, all of it stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Marcus paused mid-step, suddenly aware of the absolute silence surrounding him. He had experienced quiet nights before, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. He stood motionless, listening. Nothing. Then he noticed the second anomaly. The wind had stopped completely, not died down, stopped. The sagebrush around him stood perfectly still. In 11 years on this property, Marcus had never experienced a night with zero air movement. There was always some breeze, however faint, moving across the open desert. He felt a pressure building in his ears, similar to the sensation of rapid altitude change. His pulse quickened slightly, though he couldn't identify why. Nothing visible had changed. The stars remained steady overhead. The landscape looked exactly as it should. But something fundamental had shifted in the environment around him. Marcus continued walking, telling himself he was being irrational. Probably a pressure system moving in. Unusual atmospheric conditions, nothing more. He made it another 100 yards before he saw the light. Chapter 2. the first anomaly. The light appeared without warning in the southern sky, roughly 30 degrees above the horizon. It was not bright, not dramatic. In fact, Marcus almost missed it entirely because it resembled a star at first glance. But stars don't appear suddenly. They're either visible or they're not. This light had materialized in a portion of sky that had been empty moments before. Marcus stopped walking and focused on the light. It remained stationary, perfectly still. No blinking, no movement, just a steady, pale amber glow that seemed slightly larger than Venus at its brightest. His first thought was satellite, but satellites move. They cross the sky in steady arcs, taking several minutes to traverse from horizon to horizon. This light wasn't moving at all. His second thought was aircraft, but there was no sound, no engine noise, no navigation lights. Commercial flights often passed over this region, en route between Las Vegas and points north. He was familiar with how they looked. This wasn't that. Could be a drone, he reasoned. Some kind of high-altitude surveillance platform. The military operated out of several installations in Nevada. Unmanned vehicles were common in the area, but drones made noise. Even at significant altitude, you could hear them, and they typically displayed some kind of lighting pattern to maintain FAA compliance. This light was completely silent. Marcus watched it for what he estimated to be 5 minutes, though he later couldn't be certain. Time had begun to feel strange, elastic. Minutes seemed to compress and expand without warning. The light remained absolutely stationary. Then it moved. Not in the way aircraft move, with smooth transitions and predictable trajectories. This movement was instantaneous. The light was in one position, and then, without travelling the distance between, it was in another position, approximately 10 degrees to the east. No acceleration, no blur, just immediate relocation. Marcus felt his stomach, his tighten. Whatever he was looking at, it wasn't operating under normal physics. Objects don't teleport. They move through space in continuous motion. He considered going back to the house, getting his binoculars, maybe his camera, but something stopped him. A strange reluctance to take his eyes off the light, as if looking away might cause him to lose track of it entirely. The pressure in his ears increased. His hands felt cold despite the gloves he was wearing. The light remained in its new position for several more minutes. Then Marcus made a decision that he would later struggle to explain. He started walking directly toward it. Chapter 3. The Light Responds. Marcus moved south across his property, keeping his eyes fixed on the light. The terrain sloped gently downward, leading toward a dry creek bed that marked the southern boundary of his land. As he walked, the light remained stationary. Then, when he was approximately 50 yards from his starting position, it moved again. Same instantaneous relocation. This time shifting back to the west, maintaining roughly the same distance from his position. Marcus stopped. The light stopped. He took several steps to the left. The light adjusted its position, a subtle shift that seemed to compensate for his movement. It was tracking him. Not aggressively, not in a threatening manner, but deliberately, as if maintaining a specific distance and angle relative to his position. Marcus stood completely still, his mind racing through possibilities. Sophisticated drone, military surveillance, some kind of experimental aircraft using technology he wasn't aware of. None of those explanations felt adequate. He raised his right hand slowly, extending it toward the light. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the light pulsed once, a brief intensification of its luminosity, lasting perhaps half a second. Marcus lowered his hand. The light returned to its steady glow. He raised his hand again. Another pulse. Same duration, same intensity. It was responding to him. Marcus felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Whatever was generating that light was aware of his presence and was reacting to his actions. He began to feel something else. Not fear exactly. More like profound confusion mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. As if some part of his mind recognized what was happening, even though his conscious thoughts couldn't process it. Time continued to behave strangely. He had no idea how long he had been standing there. It could have been minutes or hours. The normal reference points he used to track time, the gradual movement of stars across the sky, the cooling of the night air, all seemed unreliable. Then he noticed the second object. Chapter 4. The second layer. At first, Marcus thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A dark spot in the sky slightly north of the light, but it wasn't moving. And it wasn't like looking at empty space. He had spent years looking at the night sky. He knew what darkness looked like between stars. This was different. This was an absence, a void, a region where stars that should have been visible simply weren't. As his eyes adjusted, the shape became more defined. It was massive, roughly triangular, or perhaps diamond-shaped. Difficult to determine exact geometry because it was only visible in silhouette, blocking the stars behind it. The object was completely dark. No lights, no surface features visible, just a black mass suspended in the sky. Marcus estimated it to be at least the size of a football field, though without knowing its exact altitude, accurate size calculation was impossible. The amber light he had been watching was positioned at what appeared to be the forward point of this dark mass. Not attached exactly. More like hovering several hundred feet in front of it. The light wasn't the object, it was a marker, a reference, point, something to draw attention while the actual craft remained nearly invisible against the night sky. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. This wasn't a drone. This wasn't any kind of conventional aircraft. This was something else entirely. The dark mass remained perfectly still. No sound, no visible propulsion, no heat shimmer or distortion of the stars around it. He tried to estimate altitude. Based on the angular size and assuming the object was as large as it appeared, it had to be at least 2,000 feet up, maybe higher. At that altitude, any conventional aircraft would be clearly audible. Helicopters, planes, jets, they all generated significant noise that carried for miles across open desert. This made no sound at all. Marcus became aware of a new sensation, a feeling of weight pressing down on him. Not physical pressure, but something else, a presence, the distinct impression that he was being observed with the same intensity he was observing the object. His thoughts began to feel strange, fragmented. Ideas would start and then slip away before reaching completion. He tried to focus on practical concerns, what to do next, whether to document this somehow, but his mind kept drifting. The pressure in his ears intensified until it became almost painful. Then the light began to pulse. Chapter 5. The signal. The pulsing wasn't regular. It wasn't like a beacon or a warning light. The intervals varied. 3 short pulses, then a long pause. 2 pulses, another pause of different duration. A single pulse. Extended pause. Marcus tried to find a pattern, some kind of sequence or code. But if there was structure to it, it remained beyond his ability to decipher. As he watched the pulsing light, something began happening in his mind. Thoughts that didn't feel like his own started emerging. Not words, not voices. Something more fundamental. Concepts, understanding, arriving fully formed without the usual process of reasoning or deduction. He suddenly knew with absolute certainty that the object was not a threat. The knowledge simply appeared in his consciousness, solid and that others had stood in similar places, at similar times watching similar lights, that this had been happening for a very long time. He knew that the object was old, not ancient in the archaeological sense, but old in a way that made human civilization seem brief and recent. These weren't thoughts he was thinking. They were information being placed directly into his awareness. Fragments of memory began surfacing. Childhood moments he hadn't thought about in decades. The face of his grandmother, who had passed 20 years ago. The specific smell of rain on desert sand. Random, disconnected pieces of his personal history rising to consciousness without prompt. Along with these memories came others that didn't belong to him. Brief flashes of perspective that weren't his own. Looking down at Earth from very high altitude, observing cities of light against dark continents, watching weather systems swirl in accelerated time. Marcus tried to resist the intrusion, but there was nothing to resist against. The information simply flowed into his mind like water finding its level. He became aware of vast distances, scales of space and time that made his entire existence feel like a single breath. The understanding that Earth was one of countless observation points, that contact, when it occurred, was rarely direct, that most encounters were passive, observational, data collection without intervention. The realization struck him that he wasn't experiencing communication. He was experiencing something more like calibration, as if his presence at this specific location and time had created some kind of intersection, a momentary overlap between two entirely different forms of consciousness. The pulsing continued. The pressure in his head intensified until it felt like his skull might crack. Then, without warning, it stopped. Chapter 6. Missing continuity. Marcus became aware of himself gradually, like waking from deep sleep. He was sitting on the ground. He had no memory of sitting down. The sky had changed. The stars had rotated. Orion, which had been rising in the east when he started his walk, was now high overhead. The Big Dipper had shifted significantly in its position. Hours had passed. Marcus looked at his watch. The digital display read 2:15 in the morning. Impossible. He had started his walk at 10. Even accounting for the time he had spent observing the light, it couldn't be past midnight. An hour, maybe 90 minutes at most. Over 4 hours had elapsed. He looked up. The sky was empty. No light, no dark mass, nothing but stars and the faint glow of the Milky Way. The silence had ended. He could hear wind moving through the sage again, distant coyotes calling, the normal sounds of the desert at night. Marcus stood slowly. His legs felt stiff, as if he'd been sitting in the same position for a long time. His hands were numb with cold. He was approximately 300 yards from where he had first seen the light. He had no memory of walking this far. The ground around him was covered in dew. His clothing was damp. The moisture suggested he had been motionless for hours while condensation formed on the fabric. He tried to reconstruct the missing time. After the pulsing stopped, what happened next? Had he watched the object depart? Had it simply vanished? When did he sit down? Why did he sit down? The memories refused to form. There was a clear before, the period of observation, and the strange information flowing into his mind. And there was a clear after, the moment of regaining awareness, sitting on cold ground. But the transition between those states was gone, erased, a clean gap in continuity. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He bent forward. Hands on his knees, breathing slowly until the sensation passed. When he straightened up, he noticed something else. His phone was in his hand. He didn't remember taking it out of his pocket. The screen was on, displaying the camera app. According to the timestamp, the app had been active for over 2 hours, but there were no photos in his gallery, no videos. The camera had been running aimed at nothing, saving nothing. Marcus turned off the phone and put it back in his pocket. He began walking back toward his house, moving carefully across the uneven terrain. Every few steps he would stop and look up, scanning the sky for any sign of the light or the dark mass. Nothing, just stars and empty space. By the time he reached his house, the eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. He had lost an entire night. Chapter 7. The After Effects. Marcus spent the following day in a state of exhausted confusion. He had slept for perhaps 2 hours, fitful and interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He tried to approach the experience rationally. He sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and attempted to document everything he could recall. The timeline, the observations, the sensations. But when he tried to describe the period when information had been flowing into his mind, he found the memories slippery, like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you try to articulate it. He knew things had been communicated. He knew he had understood something profound, but the specific content refused to solidify into language. Over the next several days, Marcus noticed other changes. His digital watch stopped working. The display would glitch, showing impossible times or strings of random numbers. He replaced the battery twice before finally accepting the device was malfunctioning beyond repair. His laptop experienced similar issues. Random crashes, programs opening on their own, the Wi-Fi connection dropping repeatedly despite his router showing full functionality. The problems were brief, lasting only about a week before electronic devices began functioning normally again. But during that period, technology seemed unreliable in ways that defied simple explanation. His sleep became irregular. Not insomnia exactly, but a disruption of his normal patterns. He would feel exhausted at odd hours, wide awake when he should have been tired. His circadian rhythm had been knocked off balance. Certain sounds began causing strong reactions. The hum of electrical transformers, the specific frequency of wind moving across power lines, high-pitched tones at the edge of hearing. These sounds would trigger brief moments of vertigo and the sensation of being watched. Marcus told no one about the encounter, not because he feared ridicule. He had lived long enough to be indifferent to others' opinions, but because discussing it felt wrong somehow, like talking about it would diminish the experience or invite attention he didn't want. There was also the matter of what he would say. How do you describe missing time? How do you explain knowledge that appeared in your mind without source? How do you convey the certainty that you were observed by something utterly foreign to human experience? He continued his nightly walks, following the same route. Part of him hoped for a repeat encounter. Part of him dreaded it. The sky remained normal. Stars, satellites, occasional aircraft with their blinking navigation lights. Nothing unusual appeared, but the sense remained that something unfinished had occurred, as if the encounter on October 17th had been an introduction, not a conclusion. 3 weeks passed before Marcus discovered he wasn't alone in what he had experienced. Chapter 8. Subtle Confirmations. Marcus made the discovery by accident. He had driven into Tonopah for supplies, stopping at the small general store that served the rural community. While waiting in line, he overheard 2 local ranchers talking. One was describing interference with his radio equipment. Multiple nights over the past month, strange patterns of static that would last for hours and then suddenly stop. The other mentioned his wife had seen unusual lights south of their property. Wouldn't talk much about it. Seemed disturbed by the experience. Marcus didn't interrupt the conversation, but afterward, he began paying attention to local talk with new interest, a comment from a gas station attendant about her dog refusing to go outside for 3 nights straight, just standing at the door and whining. A mention in the local weekly newspaper about residents reporting power fluctuations and electronic interference during the second week of October. A post on a regional online forum describing a large dark shape blocking stars observed from a location 30 miles west of Tonopah. None of the accounts were detailed, none explicitly described the same event Marcus had experienced, but there were consistent elements: silence during the encounters, a sense of time distortion, electronic interference in the days following, and notably, a reluctance to discuss the experiences in detail. Marcus began researching historical reports from the area. Tonopah had a long association with military testing and unusual aerial phenomena. The region had been used for classified aircraft development for decades, but the sightings he was finding didn't match standard explanations of experimental aircraft. The descriptions were too consistent across too many years. Lights that responded to observers, objects that moved in physically impossible ways, encounters that left witnesses confused rather than frightened. He found a reference to a Department of Energy report from 1998 documenting unexplained electromagnetic interference at a monitoring station approximately 40 miles from his property. The interference occurred in irregular patterns over a 3-month period and then ceased completely. No cause was ever determined. He found testimony from a former air traffic controller describing radar contacts that would appear and disappear without explanation. Objects that would accelerate beyond the capability of any known aircraft. The controller had filed reports. Nothing had come of them. He found a letter to the editor in a 1976 issue of the local paper, written by a resident describing an encounter nearly identical to what Marcus had experienced. The letter writer described missing time, electronic disturbances, and a profound sense that they had been observed by something non-human. The accumulated evidence suggested a pattern of activity stretching back decades: periodic encounters, passive observation, minimal interaction, no hostility, no obvious purpose. Marcus realized he was part of something ongoing. Whatever had observed him on October 17th had been observing this region for a very long time. The question wasn't whether the encounters were real, the question was what they meant. Chapter 9. Reframing the encounter. Marcus spent considerable time thinking about frameworks, ways to understand what had happened to him. The popular conception of alien contact involved communication, messages, warning about nuclear weapons or environmental destruction, offers of technology or spiritual enlightenment, dramatic interaction with clear purpose. His experience had been nothing like that. There had been no message, no warning, no attempt at meaningful exchange. Just observation, the collection of data, a momentary intersection between two forms of awareness that operated on completely different scales. He began thinking about his own experience observing wildlife. How many times had he watched birds or rabbits on his property without any desire to interact? He was simply noting their presence, their behaviour, their patterns. Perhaps that was closer to what had happened. Not first contact, not communication, just observation by something that regarded humans, the way humans might regard interesting but limited creatures. The thought was humbling and strangely liberating. It suggested the encounters weren't about humanity at all. We weren't the focus. We were simply part of the landscape being observed. The information that had flowed into his mind during the encounter, the sense of vast distances and ancient perspectives, supported this interpretation. Whatever had observed him, existed on scales of time and space that made human concerns essentially irrelevant. They weren't here to save us or destroy us or guide us. They were here to watch, to document, to collect data from countless worlds across spans of time humans couldn't comprehend. Most encounters, Marcus now believed, were probably passive. Brief overlaps, moments when observation systems became visible to those being observed. The silence made sense in this context. Why would you announce your presence when your purpose was simply to watch? The missing time made sense. If the observation involved detailed scanning or data collection, the process might require extended periods. The human mind, unable to process or remember such alien procedures, would simply skip over them, creating gaps, clean breaks in continuity. The electronic interference made sense as a side effect. Technologies designed to operate on entirely different principles might generate electromagnetic signatures that disrupted human electronics as a simple byproduct of their function. Even the reluctance to discuss the encounters made sense. Some part of the human mind recognized these experiences as different from normal reality, set apart, not to be integrated into regular conversation or normal life. Marcus realized he would probably never understand the full purpose of what had happened to him. The gap between human consciousness and whatever intelligence had observed him was too vast, but understanding the purpose wasn't necessary. The encounter had happened. It was real. It had been documented in his memory, in the subtle confirmations he had discovered, in the pattern of similar events stretching across decades. That was enough. Epilogue. The signal remains. 4 months after the encounter, Marcus returned to the location where he had regained awareness, sitting on the cold ground. It was February. Clear night, temperature near freezing. The same profound silence that characterized the high desert in winter. He stood in the exact spot, looking up at the southern sky. Nothing unusual appeared. The stars moved in their normal patterns. A satellite crossed overhead, following its predictable arc from horizon to horizon. Distant aircraft lights blinked in standard navigation patterns. The sky looked completely ordinary. But as Marcus stood there, he felt something. Not presence, not observation, just a faint recognition. As if the location itself remembered what had happened. He thought about all the people who had stood in similar places, looking up at similar skies, experiencing similar encounters, scattered across the world, across decades, perhaps across centuries, all of them returning to normal life, carrying memories of something that refused to fit into standard explanations. All of them knowing they had experienced something real, while lacking the language or framework to fully describe it. Marcus looked up at the stars for a long time. Then he walked back to his house, following the same path he walked every night. The routine had resumed. Life had returned to normal patterns. But something fundamental had changed in how he understood his place in the universe. He was not alone in the cosmos. Earth was not unobserved. Human activity was being documented by intelligences that operated beyond human comprehension. And sometimes, rarely, the watchers became visible, not to communicate, not to intervene, just to remind us that we're seen. The encounter was over. The object had departed. The missing hours would never be recovered, but the signal remained. A quiet certainty that something vast and ancient had taken note of one human being on one night in the Nevada desert, and perhaps in ways he would never understand, was still watching. The stars continued their eternal rotation. The desert maintained its silence, and Marcus Webb carried on with his life, changed by an encounter that was never meant to be understood, only remembered. Imagine a world before flight, before radar, before radio waves crossed the oceans, A world where the sky belonged only to birds and clouds and the occasional hot air balloon tethered to the earth by rope and hope. The year was 1897. The Wright brothers were still running a bicycle shop. Powered flight was a fantasy confined to the sketches of dreamers and the pages of Jules Verne novels. And yet, something was flying. Not drifting, flying, with purpose, with control, against the wind. This is not legend. This is not folklore passed down through generations until truth became myth. This is documented history. Tens of thousands of Americans reported seeing massive objects in the sky during the spring of 1897. Newspapers across the Midwest and beyond printed eyewitness accounts. Telegraph operators relayed messages from town to town, each one describing the same impossible thing. They called it the mystery airship. What follows is the account of one man who didn't just see it, he spoke to it. Or rather, it spoke to him. His name was Thomas Kellerman, and in April of 1897, he was a telegraph operator in a small city that no longer appears on most maps. He wrote this account in 1932, 3 years before his death, and it was discovered in a trunk in his daughter's attic in 1978. This is his story. Chapter 1. The night the wires went silent. I had been working the late shift at the Western Union office on Meridian Street for nearly 6 years when it happened. April 14th, 1897. A Tuesday. The kind of night where the air feels heavy even though no rain is coming. The kind of night where dogs pace and horses stamp in their stables for no reason anyone can name. The office was quiet. It usually was after 9 in the evening. Most messages had been sent. Most businesses had closed. I sat at my desk with the telegraph key in front of me, the familiar brass instrument that connected our small city to the rest of the civilized world. In those days, before telephones were common, before radio existed even as a concept, the telegraph was everything. It was how news travelled, how money moved, how the world spoke to itself. I was transcribing a message from Chicago when every line went dead at once, not flickering, not fading, dead. The silence was absolute. In 6 years of operating that key, I had never experienced anything like it. Telegraph lines fail, certainly. Storms knock them down. Animals chew through insulation. Poles fall. But it happens gradually, one line at a time. One city losing connection, while others remain. This was different. Every single line to every city we connected with went silent in the same instant. I checked the connections. I tested the battery. I tapped the key repeatedly, sending out calls that went nowhere. Nothing. The lines were physically intact as far as I could tell from inside the office, but they carried nothing. No hum, no static, just dead air. I noted the time, 9:42 in the evening. I sat there in the lamplight, waiting, because there was nothing else to do. The office felt strange in the silence. Normally there was always some background noise, the faint clicking of distant keys, the subtle vibration of signals passing through the wires even when they weren't intended for us. But now there was nothing. It felt like the entire country had stopped breathing. The silence lasted exactly 9 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, counting every second, wondering if something catastrophic had happened, if somehow the entire telegraph network had been destroyed in some unimaginable disaster. And then at 9:51, every line came back online simultaneously. The key began clicking immediately. Message after message flooded in, all marked urgent, all from different cities within a 100-mile radius. I pulled the tape as it printed, reading the words as they appeared. From Fort Wayne, large object in sky moving south, glowing, silent, not a balloon. From Lafayette, airship sighted over courthouse, impossible size, controlled movement. From Muncie, Strange craft overhead, lights along hull, moving against wind, no sound. From Anderson. Cigar-shaped vessel in sky, multiple witnesses, telegraph interference reported. They kept coming, every town, every operator, all reporting the same thing within the same 9-minute window when our lines had been dead. Something was in the sky, something large, something that moved with intention, and something that had interfered with every telegraph line in the region at exactly the same time. I stood up from my desk, my hands shaking slightly as I held the printed tape. The messages were still coming in, variations on the same theme. I walked to the front window of the office and looked out onto Meridian Street. A few people were outside, standing in small groups, pointing upward. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. That's when I saw it. Chapter 2. The Shape. No one could explain it hung in the sky about 1,000 feet up, maybe less. Distance is hard to judge when you have no reference for the object's size, but it was large, enormously large. Perhaps 200 feet long, shaped like a cigar or a massive elongated egg. The surface appeared dark, almost black, but along the underside ran a series of small lights, maybe 20 or 30 of them, evenly spaced, glowing with a soft yellow-white colour. It moved slowly from north to south, directly over the centre of town. I need you to understand what I'm describing. This was 1897. There were no airplanes. The Zeppelin would not be invented for another 3 years. Balloons existed, certainly, but they were at the mercy of wind, round and clumsy, and incapable of the controlled movement I was witnessing. This object moved deliberately. When the wind blew, from the east the object continued south. When the wind shifted northwest, the object maintained its course. It was not drifting, it was flying, and it was silent. No engine noise, no propeller sound, nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind around its hull, like the sound of a ship cutting through water. But softer, almost gentle. Several people on the street stood frozen, their faces tilted upward, mouths slightly open. I recognised the bank manager, the owner of the general store, a school teacher whose name I forget. Normal people having an abnormal experience. Someone said, "What in God's name is that?" No one answered because no one had an answer. I watched as the object passed directly overhead. The lights on its underside pulsed very slightly, not rhythmically, like a heartbeat, but irregularly, as if responding to some internal process I couldn't understand. The hull itself seemed smooth, almost seamless, without the rivets or panels you would expect on any human-made construction. It looked poured rather than built, organic in a way that metal should not be. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, stood near me on the sidewalk. He asked his father, "Is it from the government?" His father, a blacksmith with hands like hammers, shook his head slowly. "Government doesn't have anything like that, son. Nobody does." The object was moving toward the southern edge of town now, descending slightly as it went. I could see it more clearly as it lowered. There were features I hadn't noticed before, what looked like small protrusions along the sides, perhaps observation ports or windows, though they emitted no light. A subtle taper at the front, like the bow of a ship designed to cut through air instead of water, and at the rear, a series of thin structures that might have been fins or stabilizers. It passed over the last row of buildings and continued toward the open farmland beyond. As it moved, I realized it was heading directly toward the railroad yard, a flat open area where freight cars sat waiting for morning. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. I went back inside the office, grabbed my coat and hat, and locked the door behind me. Then I followed the airship. Chapter 3. The city watches. By the time I reached the edge of town, at least 50 people had gathered. Word spreads fast in a small city, especially when something impossible appears in the sky. The crowd stood at the boundary between the last street and the open land, watching as the airship descended slowly toward the rail yard about half a mile distant. The local newspaper editor, a man named Robert Marsh, was there with a notebook, scribbling frantically by the light of a handheld lantern. He looked at me as I approached. "Kellerman," he said, "your telegraph's still working." "It's working now," I replied. "Went dead for 9 minutes right before this thing appeared. Every line in the region reported the same." He wrote that down, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. "Multiple towns reporting sightings. I already confirmed at least 8 within 50 miles, all describing the same object. This is going to be front page across the country." A woman in the crowd, elderly and sharp-eyed, said loudly, "It's a sign, end times. The Bible speaks of vessels descending from heaven." A younger man countered, "It's Edison or Tesla. Has to be. Some kind of electric airship they've been testing in secret." Someone else, "Could be European. Germans have been working on dirigibles." But we all knew those explanations didn't fit. This thing moved too smoothly, too quietly, with too much control. And the timing, the simultaneous telegraph interference, the coordinated sightings across multiple cities, none of it aligned with any human technology we knew. The airship had stopped descending and now hovered about 30 feet above the rail yard. The lights along its underside grew slightly brighter, casting pale circles of illumination on the ground below. The crowd grew quieter, sensing something was about to happen. I felt it too, a pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then the lights on the airship began to pulse in a pattern, not random, deliberate, a sequence, long pulses and short pulses with precise intervals between them. I recognized the rhythm immediately. It was Morse code, or something very close to it. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket, the one I always carried for recording messages, and began writing down the sequence. Long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long, long. It repeated 3 times, then stopped. I stared at the pattern, trying to decode it, but it didn't match any standard Morse sequences I knew. The intervals were wrong. The groupings were unfamiliar. Robert Marsh leaned over my shoulder. "What does it say?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's structured like code, but it's not any code I recognize." The airship began moving again, drifting slowly eastward, away from the town and the crowd. Some people started to follow, walking across the open field, but most remained where they were, uncertain and afraid. I stood there with my notebook, watching the lights fade into the distance, and felt a strange certainty settle over me. This wasn't observation. This was communication, and it was directed at me. Chapter 4. The Interference. I returned to the telegraph office just after midnight. The streets were still busy with people discussing what they had seen. Groups gathered under street lamps, voices excited and nervous. I unlocked the door and went inside, lighting the lamp on my desk. The office felt different now, charged somehow, as if the air itself had been altered by what had happened. The telegraph key sat silent on the desk. I sat down in my chair and stared at it, thinking about the pattern of lights I had seen on the airship, the way they pulsed in structured sequences. I opened my notebook and looked at what I had written. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. Then the key began clicking on its own. My hand was nowhere near it. The key depressed and released, tapping out a rhythm that made the brass lever bounce and the sounder clack. I watched, frozen, as the tape began feeding through the register, recording whatever signal, was coming through the wire, but there was no signal. I could see that the line indicator showed no activity. The battery was disconnected. The key should not have been moving at all. It clicked for perhaps 30 seconds, printing a line of marks on the tape that made no sense in Morse code. Then it stopped. The office fell silent again. I pulled the tape free and held it up to the lamplight, studying the pattern. It was similar to what I had seen on the airship, but more complex, more detailed. There were subtle variations in the spacing, slight differences in the length of the marks that suggested layers of meaning I couldn't access. I set the tape down on the desk and looked out the window. The airship was no longer visible in the sky, but I had the unmistakable feeling that it was still close, still watching. The pressure in my head returned. That same sensation I had felt when the lights had pulsed in the rail yard. Not painful, but present, like someone standing just behind you in an empty room. I reached out and placed my fingers on the telegraph key. I began tapping out a simple message in standard Morse code. "Who are you?" The moment I finished, the key stopped vibrating under my hand. The pressure in my head intensified briefly, then vanished. I sat there in the silence, waiting for a response, but nothing came. I tried again. "What do you want?" Still nothing. Then I realized my mistake. I was using human language, human symbols. Whatever was on the other end of this communication understood structure and pattern, but not necessarily our specific codes. I needed to respond in the same way it had contacted me. I looked at the sequence on the tape, the pattern it had sent. I began tapping it back on the key, reproducing the rhythm as accurately as I could. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. I repeated it 3 times, exactly as the airship's lights had done. The key went still under my fingers. And outside, barely visible through the window, the airship descended from the clouds directly above Meridian Street. It hung there, motionless, the lights on its underside glowing bright enough now to cast shadows on the street below. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped outside. The airship lowered until it hovered just above the roof line of the buildings. I could see details now that had been invisible from a distance. The hull was not metal, or if it was metal, it was unlike any I had ever seen. It had a faint iridescence, like oil on water, shifting subtly in colour as the light moved across it. The small protrusions I had noticed earlier were definitely ports of some kind, circular openings rimmed with a darker material. And then, with no sound at all, the airship began to move again. It drifted southward, slowly, deliberately, and I understood that it wanted me to follow. I grabbed my coat and hat from inside the office, locked the door, and began walking. Several people on the street watched me go, watched the airship drifting ahead of me, but no one else followed. Perhaps they were too afraid, perhaps they were smarter than I was. I followed the airship out of town, toward the rail yard, toward whatever waited there. Chapter 5. The Descent. The rail yard was deserted at that hour. Freight cars sat in silent rows, their shadows long under the moonlight. The airship descended slowly into the centre of the open area, its lights illuminating the dirt and gravel below. I approached carefully, staying about 100 feet back, watching as the massive object lowered itself to the ground with impossible gentleness. It touched down without impact, settling onto the earth as lightly as a feather. The lights along the underside dimmed slightly, but did not go out. I could hear it now, a very faint humming, so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing. Not mechanical, more like a vibration, a frequency felt as much as heard. 2 other men had followed me from town, though I hadn't noticed them until now. One was Robert Marsh, the newspaper editor, still clutching his notebook, The other was a farmer named William Hayes, a practical man not given to flights of fancy. We stood together at the edge of the rail yard, 3 witnesses to something none of us could explain. The airship sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, humming softly, its lights pulsing in that strange irregular rhythm. Then, with a sound like air escaping from a sealed container, a section of the hull opened. Not a door swinging on hinges. The surface simply separated, creating an opening about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. No light came from inside, only darkness, and then a figure stepped out. Chapter 6. The Occupant. It was humanoid. That was the first thing I noticed. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, proportioned similarly to a human being, but not quite right. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet. Too thin, the limbs longer than they should be. It wore some kind of tight-fitting garment that covered everything except the head and hands. A material that looked almost liquid in the moonlight, dark blue or black, seamless. The head was the most unsettling feature, pale, hairless, with large eyes that caught the light and reflected it back with a faint golden sheen. The nose was small, almost vestigial. The mouth was a thin line, barely visible. The overall impression was not monstrous exactly, but profoundly other. This was not a human being in a costume. This was something else. It stood at the opening of the airship, motionless, and turned its head slowly to look at each of us in turn. When its eyes met mine, I felt that pressure in my head again. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. Not painful, but intrusive, as if something was pushing gently against the inside of my skull. I tried to step back but found I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the ground. The figure stepped forward, moving with a strange gliding motion that made it hard to tell if it was walking or floating. It approached us slowly, stopping about 20 feet away. Robert Marsh made a small choking sound and dropped his notebook. William Hayes stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I remained still, unable to move, locked in place by whatever force was emanating from this being. And then it spoke. Or rather, it communicated. There was no sound, no words, but meaning flooded into my mind with absolute clarity. Not language, concepts, images, understanding delivered directly, bypassing the need for translation. I saw maps, not maps of land, but maps of connection. Lines crisscrossing continents, nodes where the lines intersected, pulses of light moving along the paths. I saw cities connected by invisible threads, messages flowing between them at the speed of lightning. I saw the telegraph network, not as wires and poles and keys, but as humanity's first attempt at creating a nervous system, a way for the species to communicate across distance instantly. And I understood that this was what interested them. Not our cities, not our wars, not our religions or governments or art, our communication networks. The moment when we stopped being isolated communities and started becoming something connected, something that could speak to itself across vast distances. The pressure in my head increased and more images came. I saw the airship, not as a single vessel, but as one of many, positioned across the continent, observing, recording. I saw them hovering over telegraph stations, following the lines, mapping the network. They were studying the infrastructure of human communication, the way a naturalist might study the veins in a leaf. And then I saw something else, a flash of the future, though I didn't understand it at the time. I saw towers transmitting invisible waves through the air. I saw voices carried without wires. I saw light pulsing in patterns that conveyed thought and image and sound simultaneously. I saw the world covered in a web of signals so dense that no point on Earth was isolated. Everything connected, everything speaking. They were interested in the beginning of that process, the moment we became detectable. The figure tilted its head slightly, and I felt a question forming in my mind. Not words, but the sense of inquiry. It wanted to know if I understood. I tried to form a response, to think clearly and deliberately. Yes, I understand. The pressure released immediately. The figure stepped back, its large eyes still fixed on me, and then turned smoothly and walked back to the airship. It paused at the opening, looked back once more, and then disappeared inside. The hull sealed itself with that same soft hissing sound. I could move again. I staggered slightly, catching my balance, and looked at Robert and William. They both appeared shaken, pale in the moonlight. Robert picked up his notebook with trembling hands. "Did you?" he started, then stopped. "Did you see?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I saw." The airship began to rise. Chapter 7. The Message. It lifted slowly, without sound, without fire or steam, or any visible means of propulsion. The lights along the underside grew brighter as it ascended, casting long shadows across the rail yard. We watched it climb until it was several hundred feet up, then turned smoothly and begin moving northward, back toward the centre of town. I ran, I don't know why. Instinct, perhaps, the sense that something important was about to happen, and I needed to be at the telegraph office when it did. Robert and William followed, the three of us running through the dark streets as the airship drifted overhead. By the time we reached Meridian Street, people were emerging from their homes again, pointing at the sky, calling to each other. I unlocked the office and rushed inside, Robert and William close behind. I lit the lamp and sat down at the telegraph desk just as the key began clicking again. This time it was different. This time it was deliberate, controlled, sending a specific pattern. The tape fed through the register, recording the marks as they appeared. The sequence was complex, far more intricate than anything I had seen before. It went on for nearly 2 minutes, the key clicking steadily, the tape spooling out onto the desk, and then it stopped. The airship, visible through the window, rose straight up at tremendous speed and vanished into the clouds in seconds. The lights faded. The humming ceased. It was gone. I pulled the tape free and spread it out on the desk. Robert leaned over my shoulder, his breath still coming in short gasps from the run. William stood by the window, watching the empty sky. I studied the pattern, trying to make sense of it, but it was beyond my understanding. The sequences were too complex, the variations too subtle. It looked almost mathematical, like some kind of formula or equation rendered in dots and dashes. "What does it mean?" Robert asked. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think it's important." I folded the tape carefully and put it in my pocket. The three of us sat there in silence for a long time, processing what we had witnessed. Eventually, Robert spoke. "I have to write this story. People need to know." "They won't believe you," William said quietly. "They'll say you're mad." "Maybe," Robert replied, "but I still have to try." He left shortly after, and William followed. I remained in the office, sitting at the desk, thinking about the maps I'd seen, the networks of light, the future, that had been shown to me. I thought about the being that had communicated with me, the way it had looked at me with those large golden eyes, and I wondered what it had seen when it looked back. The telegraph lines remained quiet for the rest of the night. No more strange signals, no more interference, just the normal flow of messages between cities, the routine communication that kept the country connected. But I knew that nothing was routine anymore. Something had noticed us. Something had come to observe the moment when humanity learned to speak across distance, and they had left me a message I couldn't understand. Not yet. Chapter 8. The Departure. The next morning, the story spread like wildfire. Robert Marsh published his account in the newspaper, describing the airship in detail, naming me and William as witnesses. Other papers picked up the story. Within days, it was being reported across the country. Thousands of people came forward with their own sightings, describing similar objects in skies from Texas to Michigan, from California to New York. But the narrative began to change almost immediately. Editors started adding qualifying language. Alleged airship, reported sighting, mass hysteria. Scientists weighed in, offering explanations. Venus seen through atmospheric distortion, ball lightning, experimental balloons from secret government projects. The explanations multiplied, each one more confident than the last, each one ignoring the specific details that made the sightings impossible to dismiss. Robert Marsh came under significant pressure. His editor at the paper demanded he retract the story, calling it irresponsible journalism. Local officials questioned him, suggesting he had fabricated the account for attention. Within 2 weeks, a follow-up article appeared in the paper, written by Robert but clearly edited heavily, stating that upon further reflection, he believed the object had been a misidentified balloon and that the late hour and unusual circumstances had led to mistaken observations. He came to see me at the Telegraph office the night that article was published. He looked exhausted, defeated. "I'm sorry," he said. "They didn't give me a choice. It was retract or lose my position." "I understand," I told him. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked. "Should I have fought harder?" I thought about the being I had seen, the message I had received, the future I had glimpsed. "You did what you had to do to survive," I said. "That's all any of us can do." He nodded slowly and left. I never spoke to him about it again. William Hayes stopped coming into town, retreating to his farm, refusing to discuss what he had seen. I was questioned by government officials, men in dark suits who arrived from Washington and asked the same questions over and over, their faces impassive, their voices flat. They wanted to know what I had seen, what had been communicated, whether I had the Telegraph tape. I told them everything except that last part. I described the airship, the being, the images in my mind. But I said nothing about the final message, the pattern that had been sent to my telegraph key. That tape remained in my pocket and later hidden in a metal box in my home. The officials eventually left, seemingly satisfied that I had nothing useful to offer. The sightings continued for another month, then gradually stopped. By summer, the airship wave had faded from public consciousness, dismissed as a curious episode of mass delusion. Life returned to normal. The telegraph lines carried their routine messages. The country moved forward, unaware that it had been observed at a crucial moment in its development. But I knew, and I kept the tape, waiting for the day when I might understand what it meant. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Years passed, the 20th century arrived. The Wright brothers achieved powered flight in 1903, and suddenly the skies that had been impossible for humans to navigate became accessible. Airplanes multiplied. The impossible became commonplace, but the airship of 1897 was forgotten, relegated to the dustbin of historical oddities, a footnote in the story of American credulity. I continued working as a telegraph operator until 1918, when I retired. I married, had children, lived a quiet life, but I never forgot that night in April of 1897. I kept the tape hidden, taking it out occasionally to study it, hoping that new developments in communication technology might give me a framework for understanding the pattern. In 1920, when commercial radio broadcasts began, I felt a shock of recognition. The frequencies, the way signals were transmitted through the air, without wires, the patterns of electromagnetic waves. They echoed something I had seen in the images the being had shown me. The future I had glimpsed was beginning to arrive. I took out the tape and studied it again, this time with knowledge of radio technology, and slowly, over the course of months, a pattern began to emerge. The sequences on the tape corresponded to frequency intervals. Not exact matches, but close enough that the correlation couldn't be accidental. The message was a map of the electromagnetic spectrum, highlighting specific ranges that would become useful for human communication. They'd given me a guide to radio frequencies before we had discovered radio. I sat at my kitchen table, the tape spread out in front of me, and understood fully for the first time what had happened. The airship had not been exploring our world. It had been monitoring our technological development, waiting for the moment when we created infrastructure for long-distance communication. The telegraph network had been the trigger, the sign that humanity was transitioning from isolated communities to a connected civilization. And they had come to observe that transition, to record it, perhaps to encourage it by leaving behind information we would eventually be able to understand. They were tracking the moment we became detectable across interstellar distances, the moment our signals began radiating out into space. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. We had been noticed, we had been deemed worthy of observation, perhaps even assistance, but we had also revealed ourselves, broadcasting our presence to anyone or anything capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation. We had become visible. Chapter 10. Understanding Too Late. I am writing this account in 1932. I am 78 years old. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and my eyesight is failing. But I feel compelled to record what I experienced, what I understood, even if no one believes it. The world has changed dramatically since 1897. Radio is everywhere. Telephones connect continents. Television is beginning to emerge. The network of communication that I glimpsed in those images, shown to me by the being from the airship, has become reality. We are connected now in ways that would have seemed magical to someone from my youth, and we are broadcasting constantly. Radio waves carrying music and news and voices radiate out from our planet in every direction, travelling at the speed of light, reaching farther into space with every passing year. We have become a beacon, announcing our presence to any civilization capable of detecting it. I look at the tape sometimes, the message sent to me that night in the rail yard. I understand it now, mostly. It was a primer, a basic guide to the frequencies we would need for effective communication. It was meant to help us, or perhaps to accelerate our development. I don't know if the being expected me to share this information, or if it simply assumed that we would discover these things on our own, and the message was merely confirmation. I never shared it. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps I should have given the tape to scientists, let them study it, let them use the information to advance our technology faster. But I was afraid of being labelled insane, afraid of the attention it would bring, afraid of what it might mean if the information was taken seriously. So I kept silent, and the world developed radio on its own, following the natural progression of scientific discovery. Maybe that was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe my role was simply to witness, to understand, to record. I have thought often about the being I met, the way it looked at me with those large golden eyes. I have wondered what it saw when it examined me. Did it see an intelligent creature, worthy of contact? Or did it see a primitive organism, barely beginning to understand the universe it inhabited? Did our brief communication mean anything to it? Or was I simply a data point, one among thousands, recorded and filed away? I have also thought about why they came when they did. The telegraph was not the first human technology. We had been building and creating for thousands of years, but the telegraph was different. It was the first technology that allowed instant communication across vast distances, the first that created a network, a web of connection that covered the continent. It was the moment when we stopped being isolated and started being unified. That was what interested them. Not our tools or our weapons or our buildings. Our ability to communicate. Our transition from scattered tribes to a connected civilization. They were observing a threshold being crossed, a moment of transformation. And now, as I write this in 1932, I wonder if they are still watching. Radio has existed for over a decade. Our signals are spreading through space, reaching farther every day. Have they detected those signals? Are they observing our continued development? Will they return? I don't know, but I suspect they don't need to return. They came at the crucial moment, the beginning. They recorded what they needed to record, and now they are waiting, watching from a distance as we continue to evolve, as we continue to build our networks, as we continue to broadcast our presence to the universe. We think we are alone. We think the vast silence of space confirms our isolation. But I know differently. I have seen proof that we are observed. I have met a being from beyond our world, communicated with it, received information from it. We are not alone. We have never been alone. We just didn't know how to see until we learned how to speak across distance. Epilogue. The quiet warning. I will die soon. I can feel it in my bones, in the increasing fragility of my body. My daughter will inherit my belongings, including the metal box with the telegraph tape inside. I have left instructions that it should be preserved, though I doubt she will understand why. Perhaps someday, someone will find it and recognize its significance. Perhaps not. But I want to leave this final thought, this last observation that has haunted me for 35 years. The airship did not arrive when we learned to fly. It did not arrive when we built cities or created art or developed philosophy. It did not arrive when we discovered fire or invented the wheel or domesticated animals. It arrived when we learned to speak across distance, when we created networks that connected us invisibly, instantaneously, when our signals began to propagate beyond our immediate surroundings. That was the threshold. That was the moment that mattered. And if that is the case, if the ability to communicate across distance is what marks a civilization as significant, as detectable, as worthy of observation, then what happens when our communication networks expand beyond our planet? What happens when our signals reach the stars? What happens when we are not just connected to each other, but potentially connected to others? I think about this often as I sit in my chair, looking out the window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the stars I can see, are others, civilizations that learned to speak across distance long before we did, civilizations that have been broadcasting their presence for centuries or millennia, civilizations that are connected in ways we cannot yet imagine. And they are listening. They arrived when we learned to speak across distance. They observed us at that crucial moment. They left a message for us to find when we were ready. The question is not whether they will return. The question is what they heard when they listened, and whether we are ready for what comes next. This is the account of Thomas Kellerman, telegraph operator, written in the autumn of 1932. The metal box containing the telegraph tape was discovered in 1978 among his daughter's possessions. The tape remains in a private collection. Its authenticity has never been verified, and the pattern recorded on it has never been fully decoded, but radio continues to broadcast, and somewhere, perhaps, someone is still listening. And there exists a window of time that almost no one observes, not because it's hidden, but because observation requires consciousness, and consciousness requires witnesses. Between 3 and 5 in the morning, cities don't sleep so much as they idle. Traffic lights cycle through their patterns for empty intersections. Security cameras record hallways no one walks. Computer systems run diagnostics that no one monitors in real time. This is when I saw it. Or rather, this is when I noticed something that suggested I had been seeing it all along. My name is Marcus Webb, and for the past 11 years I've worked as a systems coordinator for the Regional Water Treatment Authority. It's not glamorous work. Most people don't think about where their water comes from or how it's managed until something goes catastrophically wrong. My job is to make sure nothing goes catastrophically wrong. I monitor flow rates, chemical balances, pressure differentials across a network of pumping stations, and treatment facilities that serve about 200,000 people. I work the overnight shift, midnight to 8 in the morning, 4 days a week. The pay differential makes it worth the circadian disruption, and honestly, I prefer it. No meetings, no supervisors hovering, just me, 6 monitors, and the quiet hum of systems doing exactly what they're designed to do. The event I'm about to describe didn't announce itself. There were no lights in the sky, no mysterious figures, no equipment failures or power surges. What happened was far more subtle, and in retrospect, far more unsettling. It started with a number that was technically correct, but contextually impossible. Chapter 1. The anomaly on a familiar screen. It was a Tuesday morning in late September. The timestamp read 3:17. I had been monitoring a routine chlorination cycle at Treatment Plant 7, one of our smaller facilities located about 15 miles outside the city proper. The process is automated, but we maintain human oversight because water treatment operates on the principle that redundancy saves lives. The chlorine injection rate was reading 0.72 parts per million, well within acceptable parameters. The flow rate through the contact chamber showed 2.4 million gallons per day. Normal for that time of night. The residual chlorine reading at the discharge point measured 0.68 parts per million. I had been staring at these numbers for maybe 20 seconds before I realised what was wrong. The contact time didn't match. In water treatment, contact time is the duration that water spends in contact with chlorine before it's considered disinfected. It's a function of volume and flow rate. Given the size of Plant 7's contact chamber and the flow rate being reported, the contact time should have been roughly 90 minutes. The system was reporting 93 minutes. 3 minutes isn't much. It wouldn't trigger any alarms. The system builds intolerances for exactly these kinds of minor variations. Equipment drifts, calibrations shift. Real-world physics rarely aligns perfectly with theoretical calculations. But I had been doing this job for 11 years. I knew Plant 7 systems intimately. A 3-minute drift didn't happen gradually. It happened when something in the flow dynamics changed. I checked the influent delta, no variation. I checked the chamber level sensors, stable. I pulled up the historical logs and scrolled back through the past 6 hours. The drift had appeared suddenly at 2:41 in the morning, 36 minutes ago. The contact time had been 90 minutes at 2:40. At 2:41, it jumped to 93 minutes, and it had stayed there. I ran a diagnostic on the flow meters. They came back clean. I checked for air pockets in the contact chamber that might create dead zones. Nothing. I reviewed the chemical feed logs to see if someone had adjusted injection rates, without logging it properly. All normal. The numbers made sense individually. They just didn't make sense together. I logged the discrepancy as a minor anomaly and flagged it for the day shift to investigate. Probably a sensor issue. Probably nothing. Then I noticed something else. The moment I flagged the issue and looked away from that screen to check another facility, the contact time corrected itself. When I looked back, it read 90 minutes again. Exactly 90 minutes. I stared at the screen for a full minute. The reading held stable. 90.0 minutes. Not 90.1. Not 89.9. Exactly 90. I unflagged my report and deleted the notation. I told myself I had misread it the first time. Fatigue. Too much coffee. Not enough sleep before the shift. But I didn't believe that. I have a near photographic memory for numbers. It's why I'm good at this job. I opened a blank document and typed Plant 7 contact time anomaly 2:41 to 3:17. 93 minutes reported, then corrected to 90 on observation. I saved it to my personal drive, not the system logs. I didn't know why. It just felt like the right thing to do. The rest of the shift passed without incident. I didn't mention it to the day crew during shift change. What would I even say? I saw a number that changed when I stopped looking at it. They'd think I was losing it. I drove home as the sun came up, went to bed, and slept poorly. Chapter 2. Corroboration without communication. 3 nights later, I was back on shift. Different day of the week, same time window. I had almost convinced myself the contact time thing had been exactly what I'd told myself it was. Misread data, tired eyes, coincidental timing. Then the temperature readings started drifting. Plant 7 again. This time, it was the raw water intake temperature. Our sensors monitor the temperature of incoming water because it affects chemical, dosing rates, and biological activity. The intake pulls from a reservoir that maintains fairly stable temperatures, especially at depth. At 2:39 in the morning, the intake temperature read 54.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard for that time of year. At 2:43 it read 54.7. At 2:47 it was at 55.1. A 9/10 degree rise in 8 minutes. That doesn't happen. Water temperature changes slowly. Even if there were a thermal layer mixing event in the reservoir, we'd see gradual fluctuation, not a steady linear increase. I checked the outflow temperature from the treatment process. It had risen proportionally. I checked the ambient air temperature at the facility. It had actually dropped slightly. I checked weather data for the area. Clear skies, no wind, no atmospheric anomalies. The temperature continued to climb. 55.3, 55.6, 55.8. I was reaching for the phone to call the facility maintenance line when the increase stopped. The reading held at 56.0 degrees. Then over the next 12 minutes, it dropped back to 54.2, exactly where it had started. The rise had been 0.1 degrees per minute. The decline was 0.15 degrees per minute, almost like something was testing the system's response time, or measuring its thermal characteristics. I documented it. Personal file again. Same instinct as before. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I called Maya Torres. Raymond works the same shift I do, but he monitors electrical grid distribution for the Regional Power Authority. Different agency, different systems, but we occasionally overlap on infrastructure coordination. We'd grabbed coffee a few times. He was solid, rational, not prone to jumping to conclusions. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just asked him a hypothetical. Ray, if you saw system behavior that was technically within parameters, but contextually weird, would you report it? There was a long pause. Then, what kind of weird? The kind where nothing is actually wrong, but the numbers don't tell the story they should. Another pause. You seeing something? Maybe. You? He was quiet for maybe 15 seconds. Then, yeah, Tuesday night. voltage phase imbalances on a distribution substation. Not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to notice. Came and went over about 40 minutes. I checked everything. Equipment's fine. Load patterns were normal. It just happened. What time, I asked? Started around 2:30, resolved by 3:20. My stomach tightened. Which substation? Station 44. Serves the industrial corridor and the East County area. Plant 7 was in the East County area. Did you report it? I asked. I logged it. Got a response saying they'd review it. Haven't heard anything since. When did you log it? Wednesday morning. You? Same. We were both quiet. Then Raymond said, Marcus, what's going on? I don't know, but I think something is paying attention to infrastructure. Paying attention how? That's what I'm trying to figure out. We agreed to keep each other informed if we saw anything else. The conversation ended there. Neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking. The rest of my shift was quiet. I kept watching Plant 7's data streams, but everything behaved normally. At some point around 5 in the morning, I realized I was hoping for another anomaly. Just to confirm, I wasn't imagining patterns where none existed. Nothing happened. I went home feeling more unsettled than I had after the first incident. Chapter 3. The object that isn't an object. The third occurrence was different. This time I saw something, or rather, I saw the absence of something. It was early October, about 2 weeks after my conversation with Raymond. I had started arriving at work 30 minutes early and staying 30 minutes late, expanding my observation window. I told myself it was due diligence. Really, I was looking for it, whatever it was. At 2:53 in the morning, I stepped outside for air. The operations centre where I work sits on the edge of an industrial park, surrounded by warehouses and light manufacturing facilities. At night, the area is essentially deserted. A few security lights, the occasional truck passing on the frontage road. Nothing else. The sky was clear, new moon, the kind of darkness you don't get in cities. I was looking up, not for any particular reason, just appreciating the stars, when I noticed something odd about the light patterns. There's a cell tower about a quarter mile to the northeast. Red aircraft warning lights blink at the top. I've seen those lights thousands of times. I could time my coffee breaks by their rhythm, but that night the blinks were wrong. Not in timing. They still flashed at the regulation interval. But twice, maybe 3 times, the light appeared to blink behind something. Not a cloud. The sky was clear, not a bird. The interruption was too geometric, too consistent. Something was between me and that tower. Something that didn't reflect light. Something that had depth and dimension, but no visible surface. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes watching. The interruption happened again. The red light blinked, and for just a fraction of a second, it was occluded. Not dimmed, not scattered, blocked. I went back inside and pulled up our site's external security camera feed. We have 4 cameras with overlapping fields of view, covering the parking area and building perimeter. I rewound to the time I'd been standing outside. The footage showed me clearly, standing there, looking up, but it showed nothing else. No object, no shadow, no anomaly in the frame. I switched to the infrared mode we use for overnight monitoring. Still nothing. But when I looked at the timestamp, metadata, something caught my attention. The camera had logged 3 brief buffering events during the time I was outside, each lasting less than a second. Not enough to disrupt recording, but enough to appear in the diagnostic log. I checked the network traffic analysis. During those buffering moments, data transmission from that camera had spiked, not by much, just enough to suggest the processor was working harder than usual to encode the video stream, as if it was trying to render something it couldn't quite process. I filed that in my personal documentation as well. Growing larger now. Screenshots, log exports, timestamps. I was building a case file without knowing what the case was. Chapter 4. The pattern. Over the next month, I documented 17 separate incidents. Not all at Plant 7. Not all involving the same type of system anomaly, but all sharing certain characteristics. They occurred between 2:30 and 3:45 in the morning. They lasted between 20 and 55 minutes. They involved measurements that were technically accurate, but contextually improbable. They resolved themselves without intervention. They left no permanent evidence in official logs. I created a spreadsheet. Date, time, duration, system affected, type of anomaly, correlation factors. I'm not a data scientist, but I know enough about pattern recognition to see what was emerging. Whatever this was, it operated on a schedule. Not a regular schedule. The incidents didn't happen every night or even every week, but when they did happen, they clustered around specific times. Tuesday and Thursday nights were most common. Weekend incidents were rare, but not unheard of. I cross-referenced this against shift schedules, maintenance logs, and operational patterns. Tuesday and Thursday nights were when we ran reduced staffing. Fewer people monitoring systems, more automation, longer gaps between human observation. It was choosing when to appear, based on when it was least likely to be noticed. But it wasn't trying to hide. If it wanted to avoid detection completely, it could have. Our systems aren't monitored with perfect vigilance. There are gaps, blind spots, times when no one is watching at all. Instead, it was operating in a margin, present enough to be detectable if someone was paying attention, quiet enough to be dismissed as instrumental error if they weren't. That suggested something I didn't want to consider. It wanted to be found, but only by someone who was looking carefully. Raymond had continued reporting his observations. Voltage anomalies, frequency drift, momentary load imbalances, always in the same time window, always resolving without cause. He told me his reports were being acknowledged, but never investigated. The responses were polite and professional. "Thank you for your diligence. We'll monitor the situation." And then nothing. I asked him if he thought we were being ignored. "No," he said. "I think we're being managed." That was somehow worse than being ignored. Chapter 5. The Missed Report. In mid-November, I decided to file an official report, not through my normal supervisory chain, but through the infrastructure anomaly reporting system maintained by the State Utilities Commission. It's designed for exactly this kind of thing, unexplained system behaviour that doesn't rise to the level of emergency but warrants documentation. I spent 3 hours writing it. I included timestamps, system logs, correlation analysis, and cross-references to Raymond's electrical grid observations. I didn't speculate about causes. I just presented data. Factual, professional, verifiable. I submitted it on a Monday morning before I went to bed. By Wednesday night, when I came back on shift, I had a response. The email was cordial. It thanked me for my thoroughness. It acknowledged that I had identified some interesting correlations. It noted that periodic anomalies in automated systems are common and generally attributable to sensor drift, environmental factors, or timing coincidences in how multiple systems sample data. The report had been reviewed by appropriate technical staff. No safety issues were identified. No pattern of equipment failure was evident. The anomalies I documented fell within expected operational variance. The case was closed. No follow-up questions, no request for additional data, no interest in the correlation with electrical grid observations. Just noted, reviewed, closed. I read that email 4 times. Then I called Raymond. "Did you file a formal report?" I asked. "Last week." "You?" "Yeah, got a response today." "Let me guess. Thank you for your diligence, case closed." pretty much. Same here, he paused. Marcus, I've been thinking about this. Maybe we're making something out of nothing. These systems are complex. Coincidences happen. You don't believe that? No, he admitted, but I don't know what I do believe, and I'm starting to think maybe that's intentional. What do you mean? I mean, whoever reviewed our reports knew exactly what we were seeing, and they closed the cases anyway. Not because they think we're wrong, but because they think we're right and they don't want it investigated. I didn't sleep well that day. Chapter 6. The Near Encounter. December brought early snow. Not much, just enough to make the roads inconvenient and give me an excuse to leave for work even earlier than I'd been doing. I told myself it was about avoiding traffic. Really, I was still looking. On a Thursday night, 3 days before Christmas, I got closer than I ever wanted to. We'd had a minor equipment issue at Plant 7. A backup generator had failed its automated test cycle, which meant someone needed to physically inspect it to determine if it was a genuine fault or a sensor error. Normally, we'd wait for day shift maintenance, but the forecast called for heavy snow overnight, and protocol required backup power systems to be verified operational before severe weather. I volunteered to drive out there. It's only 15 miles. I had the access codes. I'd done field inspections before. I left the operations centre at 2:23 in the morning. The drive was uneventful. Roads were clear. No other vehicles. The snow hadn't started yet, but I could smell it in the air. That particular metallic crispness that comes before a storm. I reached Plant 7 at 2:41. The facility was quiet. Security lights illuminated the main treatment buildings. Everything looked normal. I parked near the generator building, grabbed my inspection tablet and flashlight, and headed inside. The generator checked out fine. The sensor had failed, not the equipment. I documented it, reset the test cycle, and confirmed it passed. Total time inside, maybe 12 minutes. When I came back outside, something was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not dramatically. Wrong. Just wrong. The air felt thick, not humid, not cold, just resistant. Like moving through something slightly denser than air should be. The sound was off too. I could hear the hum of the facility equipment, but it seemed muted, distant, like I was hearing it through a wall. I looked up. The sky was overcast now, clouds having moved in while I was inside. But the light was strange. The security lights created halos that extended farther than they should. The shadows were too sharp. Then I noticed my truck. It was exactly where I'd parked it, but it looked farther away. Not much, maybe 10 or 15 feet, except I knew I'd parked it 30 feet from the generator building entrance. I always park in the same spot. I walked toward it. Each step felt normal, but when I reached the truck, I turned back toward the building. The distance looked right now. 30 feet, like it should be. My depth perception wasn't working correctly. I got in the truck and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 2:58. I had been inside for 12 minutes. It was now 34 minutes since I'd left the operations centre. That left 10 minutes unaccounted for. 10 minutes of drive time on a 15-mile route that should take 18 minutes. I sat there trying to make sense of it. Had I driven faster than I realised? Had I lost time inside the building? Was the clock wrong? Then I looked at my phone. It agreed with the truck's clock. 2:58. I checked my inspection tablet. The timestamp on my generator report showed I'd entered the building at 2:43 and completed the inspection at 2:55. That was 12 minutes, but I'd arrived at 2:41. 2 minutes were missing between when I parked and when I entered the building. I tried to remember those 2 minutes. I remembered parking. I remembered getting my equipment. I remembered walking to the door. But there was a gap, a smoothness in the memory like a transition seen in a movie where time passes, but nothing happens. I drove back to the operations centre. The route took exactly 18 minutes. Nothing unusual happened. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I'd almost convinced myself I'd just lost track of time. Simple explanation, human error. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been somewhere else for those 2 minutes. Somewhere that wasn't quite aligned with normal space. Chapter 7. After Effects. No missing time after that. No injuries, no dramatic physical evidence. But things were different. Small things, subtle things. My sense of timing became imprecise. I've always been able to estimate elapsed time accurately. It's a useful skill for my job. But after that night at Plant 7, my internal clock was consistently off. I'd think 5 minutes had passed and it would be 7. I'd estimate 15 minutes and it would be 12. I started having trouble with spatial relationships, not dramatically. I could still drive, still function normally, but occasionally a doorway would seem narrower than I remembered, or a hallway would feel longer. The distortions were brief, momentary, but persistent. I also developed an acute awareness of being watched. Not by people, not by cameras, just watched. The feeling would come on suddenly, usually during the quiet hours at work. I'd be monitoring systems, and the back of my neck would prickle. I'd turn around, nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I mentioned this to Raymond during one of our coffee meetings. He looked uncomfortable. "Yeah," he said, "I've been feeling that too, like something's paying attention." "Since when?" "About a month, since I filed that report." We didn't talk about it much after that. What could we say? We were both rational people who worked with empirical systems. We dealt in measurements and verifiable data. Feelings of being watched didn't fit into that framework, but the feeling persisted. I also started noticing patterns in my peripheral vision. Quick movements that resolved into nothing when I looked directly. Shadows that didn't align with light sources. Brief distortions in reflective surfaces. None of it was dramatic enough to document. None of it was clear enough to verify. It existed in that margin between perception and imagination. The most disturbing change was the dreams. I don't normally remember my dreams, but starting in January, I began having the same dream repeatedly. I was standing in the parking lot at Plant 7 looking up. The sky was full of stars, but they were wrong, moving in patterns that stars don't move, and I was aware that something enormous was overhead. Not threatening, just present, observing. In the dream I always felt calm, curious, like I was being shown something important that I couldn't quite understand. I'd wake up with no anxiety, no fear, just a profound sense of having missed something obvious. Chapter 8. Independent Confirmation. In late February I found the forum. I wasn't looking for it. I was researching infrastructure monitoring protocols for work and stumbled across a discussion thread on an engineering message board. The topic was about unexplained sensor anomalies in automated systems. Most of the posts were routine troubleshooting, but one thread caught my attention. Someone with the username GridWatch had posted a detailed description of voltage anomalies they'd observed over several months. The pattern was identical to what Raymond had documented. I created an account and messaged them privately. I didn't give details, just asked if they'd noticed any temporal patterns. They responded within an hour. Tuesday and Thursday nights, 2:30 to 4, you too? We ended up talking for 3 hours. GridWatch was a power systems engineer in Oregon, 600 miles from where I was. Different grid, different utility authority, but the same pattern, same time window, same unexplained resolution. Over the next week, I found 4 more people: a wastewater treatment operator in Nevada, a telecom systems analyst in Colorado, a meteorologist in Idaho who'd noticed atmospheric measurement anomalies, an air traffic controller in Montana who tracked brief radar artifacts. All of them had seen something. All of them had reported it through official channels. All of them had been told essentially the same thing. Interesting observations, no safety concern, case closed. None of them knew each other. None of them had connected their observations to anything larger. Until now. We created a private group. We started sharing data, and the pattern became undeniable. Across 5 states, over 18 months, at least 27 people had documented the same phenomenon. System anomalies that were technically valid, but contextually impossible. Always during low observation hours, always resolving without intervention, always occurring in proximity to critical infrastructure. The most chilling discovery was the geographic pattern. When we plotted the incidents on a map, they formed a rough grid, not random, not clustered in one area, distributed across the western United States in a way that suggested methodical coverage. Something was surveying infrastructure, systematically, comprehensively, and it had been doing so for at least a year and a half, probably longer. We just hadn't noticed until we compared notes. Chapter 9. The theory that explains too much. In March, I developed a working hypothesis. I didn't share it with the group immediately. I wanted to test it against the data first. The hypothesis went like this. What we were observing wasn't visiting Earth, it wasn't arriving or departing. It was already here, had been here, would continue to be here. It existed in the margins of human observation, not hiding, not avoiding detection, simply operating in the spaces between our attention. It interacted with systems, not people. It measured, it tested, it observed, but it didn't interfere beyond what was necessary to gather data. The contact was non-invasive, almost respectful. It triggered anomalies only when they wouldn't cause harm. It resolved them before human operators needed to act. It avoided patterns that would force official acknowledgement. This suggested several disturbing possibilities. First, it understood human systems well enough to know how they were monitored. Second, it had access to operational schedules and staffing patterns. Third, it could predict when anomalies would be dismissed versus investigated. Fourth, it had been doing this long enough to refine its approach. The most unsettling implication was this. The phenomenon wasn't studying our infrastructure to understand our technology. It was studying our infrastructure to understand us, how we organize, how we coordinate, how we respond to anomalies, how we filter information, how we decide what to investigate and what to ignore. It was learning the patterns of human collective behavior by watching how we managed our shared resources. When I finally shared this hypothesis with the group, the response was mixed. Some thought I was over-interpreting. Some thought I wasn't going far enough. But no one could offer a better explanation that fit all the data. The air traffic controller, whose username was Skywatch, raised a question that stuck with me. If it's been here all along, and it's this good at staying in the margins, how many of them are there? And what happens when they're done studying? No one had an answer. Chapter 10. Why it never became a story. You'd think something like this would make headlines. 27 witnesses, documented evidence, multiple jurisdictions, a pattern spanning multiple states. But it didn't. Here's why. No single incident was dramatic. Each anomaly, taken individually, was easily explained. Sensor drift, calibration error, environmental factors, human fatigue. No evidence survived rigorous scrutiny. We had logs and timestamps and correlation analyses, but we didn't have physical proof. No photographs, no video, no material samples. Nothing that couldn't be dismissed as instrumental artifact. No authority denied it strongly enough to raise questions. Our reports were acknowledged, they were reviewed, they were filed. The response was professional, thorough, and completely non-committal. There was nothing to push against, no cover-up to expose, just polite bureaucratic processing. The story died because it was too quiet to fear. It didn't fit the narrative of how contact should happen. No invasion, no communication, no revelation. Just data that didn't quite add up in ways that most people would never notice. I tried talking to a journalist once, met them at a coffee shop, showed them the spreadsheet, the timeline, the geographic distribution. They were interested for about 10 minutes. Then they asked the question that killed it. What do you want people to do with this information? I didn't have an answer because there was nothing to do, no threat to prepare for, no action to take, no demand to make. It was just information about something that was happening, and that wasn't enough. The journalist thanked me for my time and never followed up. Our private group continued documenting incidents. We compared notes, we refined our data, but we stopped trying to convince anyone else. What was the point? We'd learned what we needed to learn. We were being studied, carefully, patiently, by something that had no interest in being known. And the world continued exactly as it had before. Epilogue. Still there. It's late April now. I'm writing this during my shift. 3:32 in the morning. The quiet hours. Plant 7 is running normally. All systems within parameters. Nothing unusual in the logs. But I'm watching, and I know it's there. Not tonight maybe, but soon, Tuesday or Thursday, between 2:30 and 4, something will drift. Some measurement will be technically correct, but contextually impossible. And I'll document it, add it to the file, send it to the group, and nothing will change. The phenomenon is still operating, still measuring, still learning. The incidents haven't stopped. They've just become part of the background, part of what infrastructure does in the hours when no one is watching. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it's building toward. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's purely observational. Maybe we're as interesting to it as soil bacteria are to us. Present, measurable, ultimately not concerning. Or maybe it's waiting, gathering enough data to understand us completely. Learning our patterns so thoroughly that when it does make itself known, we won't even realize it's happening. The water still flows, the power still runs, the systems still hum along exactly as they're designed to, and somewhere in the margins, in the spaces between human attention, something watches. It's not hiding, it's just patient, and I suspect it's been here much longer than we think. The quiet hours are when the world runs on automation, when cities idle instead of sleep, when critical systems operate without human oversight. It's the perfect time for observation. And I think it knows we know it's there. It just doesn't care if we believe it. Because belief isn't required for observation to continue. The numbers tell their story. The patterns persist. The evidence accumulates in private files and abandoned reports. And in the quiet hours, when the world stops watching, we are being watched in return. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if it ends. I just know that whatever is out there operates on timescales we can't imagine. And what seems like an 18-month study to us might be the briefest glance to them. A moment of curiosity, a passing interest, a casual survey of infrastructure managed by creatures who still measure time in years instead of eons. We build systems to last decades. It thinks in millennia, and will never be able to prove it was here, because it leaves no evidence that can't be explained away, no proof that survives the filter of official skepticism, no story dramatic enough to overcome the human preference for comfort over truth. So it remains what it has always been, an anomaly, a curiosity, a pattern that technically shouldn't exist but can always be dismissed. And in the quiet hours, I watch my screens. And I know I'm not the only one watching. The question isn't whether it's real. The question is what happens when it finishes collecting data. And whether we'll even notice when it does. My shift ends in 4 hours. The sun will rise, the day crew will arrive, systems will continue their routines. And tonight, during the hours nobody watches, it will be back. Measuring, testing, observing. Still there, always. There, in the quiet hours, where nobody looks,